Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of Gridiron Gridlocks. But ladies and gentlemen, we are switching it up to Hardwood Gameday, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we're still working at the whole name of the basketball show for our college edition of Gridiron Gridlocks. But ladies and gentlemen, we are changing the name for college basketball season, ladies and gentlemen, to Hardwood Gameday. I'm your host, Trevor Williams, and you can follow me at my own personal Twitter account as TWilly624, as well as you can follow all the other sporting content that we got on the Empty the Bench Network, as also known as ETB Network. So definitely go and give us a follow and support for that most part. But ladies and gentlemen, games have started a little bit early in the college bracket because, you got the whole NFL, NFC, AFC championship games. So probably some games are shifted up earlier in the slate, ladies and gentlemen. I would say it's definitely one of those things that we're going to keep a close eye on as the day progresses. But right now we have a game underway, which is in women's college basketball. We got Georgetown versus Xavier. Start of the fourth, about 7:22 left in the fourth quarter of that game. Georgetown is now up 51-42 against Xavier. So we're going to do our best to keep giving you up-to-date content as that game unfolds and shakes itself out as that game ends up wrapping itself up. But we also have other games that are going on today, ladies and gentlemen, in the women's slate of games. We have Eastern Illinois versus Morehead State on ESPN. That game has basically been underway since 10 a.m., so that one's underway as well. You also got Boston College and Louisville at 11 a.m. on the ACC network. A couple of other games, you got the Holy Cross versus American University on ESPN Plus. You have Army Navy at 11 on CBS, ladies and gentlemen, for women's basketball. So we're just going to run through a quick slate of that. We have Copen State versus Norfolk State, also at 11. Wilford versus Mercer at 11 as well. East Tennessee State versus UNC Greensboro. So a lot of games at the 11 o'clock slot for women's basketball on ESPN Plus. So make sure you get yourself your favorite beverage, or you're finishing up brunch or breakfast, depending on what you end up preferencing and taking for the most part, ladies and gentlemen. So we got a full slate of good basketball to keep you a little bit toasty as the winter weather comes into this part of the country where I'm based at in Columbus, Ohio, ladies and gentlemen. But let's look at the men's side of things before we get into the meat and potatoes of the ranked matchups that's going to keep us very close and develop as the day progresses on. Also, on the men's side, you also have Wilford and Mercer at 11 on ESPN Plus. Then you have Ole Miss and Kentucky, some SEC action that just got underway as well. You have Berlamere and North Florida at 11 as well on ESPN Plus. So a lot of good things going on at this point in time for the men's side. Not as many games as the women that we have on Saturday, ladies and gentlemen. So we're just going to keep refreshing to make sure we have the latest and greatest of all the trends going on for basketball. So we'll do some periodic spot checking here and there as the games, like I mentioned earlier, get underway for the most part. So we're just going to follow suit, and we'll go from there. So the games that we're looking at, we got about 5 good ranked matchups between the men and the women. Well, not 5 good. We got basically 3 for the men and 2 for the women that are really key games that are going to have impacts. The women's games are going to be played on Sunday, and then the men's games are going to be played on today. So trying to figure out how we want to break this down leading into the men's games, going to the women. So we're still deciding that for the most part, but we'll dive into the women's games to really kick us off to give our women some love that we got going on. The games that we're going to be looking at, ladies and gentlemen, for that, I'm just trying to get the stats pulled up for you guys. We have Ohio State versus Iowa. So number 12 Lady Buckeyes versus the Lady Hawkeyes, who's number 10. Women's college basketball, Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern time, 11 a.m. Pacific time on Peacock, ladies and gentlemen. Definitely going to be an interesting matchup as we got some Big Ten clashes going on. Iowa, ladies and gentlemen, in the Big Ten for the women are 7-0 from when I got this information. So as things progress, there might be some slight adjustments of according to schedule when teams play. But the data points that I have, they are 7-0 in the conference, and Iowa is also 16-2. Very solid, performance for the Iowa Hawkeyes women right now, looking pretty good across the board on that front line, ladies and gentlemen. But the Lady Buckeyes have been playing phenomenal, as well as their record is 17-2 with a record in the Big Ten as 6-1. Looking pretty good across the board. You can't really complain on how this is going to end up shaking down across the board for the most part. But as you look at the points that are normally given between these two schools, the Iowa Hawkeyes average about 80 points per game compared to the Ohio State Buckeyes with 85.4 points per game. So if you look at the offense, Ohio State produces more points across the board. But if you look on the defensive front, it's only a 2-point difference in margin, ladies and gentlemen. The Iowa Hawkeyes, for the most part, give up about 61.8 points per game. So let's just round up to 62, playing with clean numbers. And for Ohio State, ladies and gentlemen, they average about 63 points as they end up giving up across the board. So if you look at that, definitely very defensive, keeping teams down in their points for sure. But from the field goals, it's definitely going to be a huge percentage. 3% on the field is massive if you start looking at the numbers and statistics in basketball, ladies and gentlemen, because Iowa has 49% from the field compared to Ohio State's 46% from the field. So yes, Ohio State produces more points. However, they don't shoot good from the field. So maybe it's coming from foul shots, getting the fouls that they need to go up to the line, so they don't have to rely so much on the field to be able to capitalize on the points. So we're definitely going to see how the field plays into this one for sure, ladies and gentlemen, as things end up developing for this game across the board. For the rebounds, ladies and gentlemen, Iowa captures the victory on this front for the most part. You have a 41 point. Basically, we're just going to round up. We're just going to get rid of the decimals and round up. So per game, Iowa averages about 42 rebounds per game compared to Ohio State's basically 40. So again, close in margin, very, very evenly matched across the board. Assist, basically 21 for Iowa. Ohio State, about 20, more like 19.4. So 19.5. We'll stick with the halves, even though I said I didn't want to deal with that. Blocks, Ohio State produces more blocks with almost about 5 blocks per game compared to Iowa's 3. So Iowa's not really going too much for the blocks. They're trying to be a little bit more on the scrappy front, where they're averaging about almost 9 steals a game compared to Ohio State's 13 steals a game. So Ohio State's a scrappier team when you look at the steals, trying to get those second chance points, create those fast breaks, which is probably why they get the 85 points, relatively good across the board, which why we kind of end up liking the Lady Buckeyes in this scenario, just taking care of business in this one. Even though that Iowa has a great Big Ten record, almost a percentage of 67.8% chance to win this game compared to Ohio State's 32.2 percentage to win this game. It's going to be a good one. The name of the game here is minimize the turnovers, and they shall be fine on this hardwood court. But they got to shoot better from the field. You can't be shooting 46% and expecting to beat Iowa in this fashion. Even though, the rebounds are looking pretty good for Iowa on that front, it's that field goals. If you can't capitalize on the rebounds, now, granted, I don't know how those rebounds are broken down between offensive and defensive rebounds. It's just a stat line on the average rebounds that they have as a whole. So if I got the breakdown of how their defense ends up swinging, how that ends up in shaking, that will kind of drive to see how many second chance points that both of these teams end up getting. But if we look at the last 5 games, as we can see, they don't have a common opponent that we end up looking like. But again, what I mentioned about Ohio State's 85 points, if you look at their last 5 games, they played TCU. They won 71-69. Beat Penn State 108-84, beat Maryland 89-76, beat Illinois 87-74, 78-69, and then beat Rutgers 71-49. So as you can see, Ohio State likes to put up points either early 70s or you get really high games where they end up like the Penn State scenario. So trying to average out that number, you get relatively close to that 85, but you were expecting this Ohio State team to score into, the middle 80s for the most part, what we can end up getting. Now, Iowa, on the other hand, they played Michigan State, won 75-86. No, it's a 68. I'm bad at reading numbers today, ladies and gentlemen. Then you have when they played Oregon, they have 74-66. They beat Indiana and won by 3 to 56-53. Then they beat Northwestern to 67-58, and then they end up beating Nebraska 86-76 on that front, ladies and gentlemen. So when you have that, again, this Iowa team really not cracking more than 80 points a game for the most part, just averaging middle to 70s. So I expect this one to be relatively in the same boat where the teams are going to be hovering around the 70s. So I wouldn't expect much less than that, ladies and gentlemen. For my wins in this one, like I said, being an Ohio State fan, I have the bias, but based on how, the points that Iowa have been allowing, they're a defensive squad. They don't want you to cross more than 70 points, but they gave that up to Nebraska. But they're trying to keep that margin very healthy in this one. So we're definitely going to be seeing a thriller of a game on that front, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I believe it's played in Iowa in this one, so it's definitely going to be that home court advantage. So definitely going to see what those Buckeyes can do in that matchup. So you can catch Ohio State on Sunday versus Iowa, number 10. I know I'm going to get flack from this in the comments for messing up on the schools and teams. Hopefully, not the universities are looking to, send merch saying you need to know our names and get me a big flag. So definitely going to be pushing for those comments for sure, ladies and gentlemen. If you know them, please send them my way. We can figure something out to get the merch, and I can wear it live on set if those games make the selection for Hardwood Gameday, ladies and gentlemen. So let's dive into the other women's matchup. Like I said, you can catch this game at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 a.m. Pacific Time on Peacock. Ohio State number 12 in the nation for Iowa, number 10 for women's college basketball on Sunday. Now let's get to the game that people are going to be excited for, though it's going to be clashing with the NFL on that time slot. I don't know why they did it, but I understand you're fighting for prime time and against the NFL. But here we are. We're going to the land of the SEC for women's college basketball. We got number 5 Vanderbilt versus number 2 South Carolina. A great game to watch, ladies and gentlemen. 3 p.m. Eastern Time, noon Pacific Time on ESPN. Great matchup across the board. Great matchup. Vanderbilt has a great campaign right now in the SEC. They're 20-0 from the last time I pulled the data, and they're 6-0 in the SEC. Now you look at South Carolina, which is basically 19-2 across the board with a record of 5-1 in the SEC. Very good margin. Percentage chance to win. ESPN is saying that Vanderbilt has 11% chance to win. You're telling me an undefeated Vanderbilt right now and only has 11% chance to beat South Carolina. That just doesn't seem right. I feel like that's a little disrespect right out there. A little disrespect saying that an undefeated SEC team, 6-0 in the conference, and it's 20-0 to this point, only has 11% chance to beat South Carolina. Yes, South Carolina is a good ball club and all that stuff, but I think you should give a little bit more respect to an undefeated team than 11% chance to win. Yes, I granted it's in South Carolina. Yes, this is going to be difficult, but when you break it down, team is fairly evenly matched for the most part. Let's like I said, let's break it down and stare at the points. Average points per game for South Carolina is about 88. Vanderbilt is about 86. Relatively close, 2-point difference, not too drastically. Points against South Carolina is 55, basically 56 compared to Vanderbilt's 58 points given up, so relatively close. But from the field, ladies and gentlemen, 51% for South Carolina. 51%. Think about it. Every time that someone shoots from the field, one of 2 shots will go in. That's how efficient the field is for South Carolina. Now, Vanderbilt, on the other hand, a little close, about 80, not 80, but 48% from the field. Not too bad, but that percentage for South Carolina, about 51%, higher than average of one of every two shots goes in. That is an impressive number that you have for South Carolina, and that's why you could see the ESPN analysis of the 89% chance from the field, chance to win based on the field alone. Now you look at rebounds. South Carolina dominates the board, which again feeds into the factor of Vanderbilt's only 11% chance to win in this matchup. But Vanderbilt basically almost 39 compared to South Carolina's 44. That's a huge margin. Assists goes to Vanderbilt with 21 compared to 18. But the blocks, South Carolina is a little bit more, about averaging about 6.5 for the blocks compared to Vanderbilt's, a little slightly over 4.5 blocks per game. And you look at the steals, ladies and gentlemen, Vanderbilt's a little bit more on the scrappier side. You got, 12, almost a little bit over 12.5 steals per game compared to South Carolina's 10 steals per game for the most part, ladies and gentlemen. So definitely going to be something to keep a close eye on in the matchup like this. And if we could look at the last 5 games, South Carolina had a tough loss to Oklahoma in overtime to 94-22, 82 against Oklahoma. Very, very tough one to end up losing in that fashion. But if you're looking at like some common opponents, they didn't have really much common opponents in the last 5 games, so you can't really do, apple to apples comparison. But they have a small school that South Carolina ended up playing. I don't know which word I can see. It's the abbreviation of COOPP, which is 90-48. They beat Texas to 68-65. They beat Georgia 65-43 and beat Arkansas 93-58. So across the board, South Carolina pretty much dominates. They kind of all over the board between 90s and the 60s from what we've seen in the last 5 games. So wide margin that we're seeing that they're going up against, ladies and gentlemen. Vanderbilt, on the other hand, very solid ball squad of just trying to crack over 80 to 90 points a game. They play Auburn 81-53, beat Michigan 72-69, and then they end up beating Mississippi State 89-84, beat Texas A&M 91-51, and beat Missouri to 99-68. So across the board, ladies and gentlemen, you have a very solid Vanderbilt club, and I think the disrespect for them only having a 11% chance of victory is very alarming based off the last 5 games. But at the same time, I don't make the analysis. I don't make the predictions on how that ends up shaking itself out. Definitely something that we're going to have to keep a close eye on. You can, like I said, this game is going to be right around when the AFC championship game is being played. So you might have a split screen trying to bounce back and forth depending on how the AFC championship game goes. If it's a runaway in the AFC championship game, definitely flip this on. This is a game that is highly anticipated. Definitely going to be a thriller to watch in women's college basketball, ladies and gentlemen. So you can catch number 5 Vanderbilt versus number 2 South Carolina, Sunday, 3 p.m. Eastern time, noon Pacific time on ESPN, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let's get into the men's slot. We got 3 great men's games that are happening today, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go at the top of the key and get the men's games for today's slate underway that we like so much to keep our close eyes on. North Carolina, number 22 in the nation, versus Virginia, number 14 in the nation, ladies and gentlemen. Men's college basketball today, 2 p.m. Eastern time, 11 a.m. Pacific time on ESPN, ladies and gentlemen. What a great game to start off on this glorious Saturday, 2 p.m. Eastern time. So by that point, you're thinking about wrapping up your lunch or having a later lunch, depending on what's going on in this matchup. ACC action at its finest, ladies and gentlemen. North Carolina looking 3-3 in the ACC conference, looking to turn that around, ladies and gentlemen. But Virginia coming in with a 5-1 record in the ACC, ladies and gentlemen. But if you look at the records thus far, North Carolina is 15-4 this season compared to Virginia's 16-2. Very impressive record we got going on for Virginia in this matchup, ladies and gentlemen. But let's break down the stats, break down the analysis, and pinpoints of what we got going on in this game. Average points per game for these two universities. North Carolina, about 82, compared to Virginia's 84 points per game. So the edge goes to Virginia if you're looking at averages. Points against North Carolina is about 69.5 compared to Virginia's 67.1 points given up. So North Carolina's defense is a little bit weak, but you could also argue that's attributed to some of the losses into that front. From the field, relatively close. So we're going to have a very close game. North Carolina from the field is 48% compared to Virginia's 47% chance from the field. So definitely going to be something that we're going to keep a close eye on. When you have something that's very close to on the field, it's where the rebounds come into play. But the rebounds are pretty much status quo. North Carolina's about 71 for the rebounds, and Virginia's about 42 for the rebounds on that front. Assists, they're both about 17, so not going to play too much of a factor here, ladies and gentlemen. On that front, on the blocks, North Carolina doesn't do a lot of blocking, sending it to the third row. They just don't do that. And that's about almost 4 blocks per game compared to Virginia's 6.4, so almost 6.5 blocks per game. Steals, you almost got 6 steals for North Carolina averaging per game. Virginia about a little closer to 7, but it's more 6.5 over the steals per game, ladies and gentlemen. So I like the edge of Virginia in this one based off the stat lines. The blocks are what's going to really be a key factor in this scenario. I think Virginia is going to get more blocks off in this game, which is going to impact the field goal percentage for North Carolina if the block starts to take over and it turns into a block party down in Virginia, ladies and gentlemen. But common opponents that they have is SMU is definitely a key factor that we're going to look at too. Virginia beat SMU 72-68, but North Carolina lost to SMU to 97-83 in that matchup. So having that head-to-head there, give it to Virginia. But then they also had Cal in the mix, where Virginia won 84-60, and North Carolina lost 84-78. Again, head-to-head matchup. Virginia won that one. And if you look at Stanford, North Carolina lost to Stanford by 5 in a 95-90 close matchup. But Virginia shut down Stanford 70-55. So with that being looked at and across the margin in that slate, ladies and gentlemen, we need to give Virginia the edge and the benefit of the doubt in this matchup. For sure, ladies and gentlemen, it's one of those things where you just can't overlook what's going down. Even though North Carolina came back in this scenario and beat Notre Dame 91-69, but they just been losing to teams that Virginia's beat very convincingly. And I think that's something that you can't overlook when you try to start comparing teams that they played against. And that's why, like I said, I like the edge for Virginia in this matchup. I personally like where this is going to end up going for sure. So you can catch number 22, North Carolina versus number 14, Virginia, men's college basketball today, 2 p.m. Eastern time, 11 a.m. Pacific time on ESPN. And I like Virginia based off the stats and what I gave you guys in this matchup to have a solid victory performance across the board, ladies and gentlemen. A solid performance across the board. Now let's go into some Big Ten action for you guys. We got number 11, Illinois versus number 4, Purdue, men's college basketball. Today, 3 p.m. Eastern time, noon Pacific time on Fox. We have a good friend that's going to be there today. Zane is going to be in attendance to watch this game. I told him if he has a chance to take pictures as best he's able to. I know that game is going to be a thrilling game to watch. So I wish him, the satisfaction of Illinois winning this matchup. But I don't think you can overlook how Purdue's been playing this year, even though they had a tough loss to UCLA, losing by 2. I think it's going to be a thrilling game, but you got to look at the field, the stat lines. I got to give Purdue the slight edge, even though they're tied in conference record right now, both 7-1 in conference play, which is looking relatively good. Illinois has a 16 wins and 3 losses in their season thus far, and Purdue is 17-2 thus far right now in their overall season. So very good stuff that we're seeing across the board in the most part for this Big Ten play that we got going on. So as we look at the last 5 games, their only common opponent in the last 5 games is Iowa. So we're going to start with Iowa in the first part of it. So Purdue beat Iowa 79-72. Now, if you're on the flip side, winning by 5 margin for that point. Illinois beat Iowa 75-69. So 6-point margin of victory on that front. So relatively close if you look at maybe missed foul shots come into play, what the margin is, or 3 went in a different direction. But, make your foul shots so we make an easier stat line when you have common opponents. But like I said, this Purdue squad, it kind of fluctuates a little bit. After the tough loss to UCLA 69-67, they beat USC 69-64. Outside of Iowa, they beat Penn State 93-85, and they beat Washington 81-73. Illinois, on the other hand, beat Maryland as an 89-70, Minnesota 77-67, beat Northwestern 79-68, and then outside of Iowa, they beat Rutgers 81-55. So very, very good stats we're seeing for both of these ball clubs right now. Now, looking at the points per game, you got to give it to Iowa. They're about 85 points per game compared to Purdue's 84 points per game. Defensive-wise, relatively close. It's more giving up about 67 points per game given up, and Purdue is about 68. But I'm going to keep harping on the same thing. When you shoot more than 50% from the field, it's showing that you're very efficient about taking your shot selection and having good ball movement, taking those open shots when they come available to you, which is where Purdue maximizes it with 51% going into their favor compared to Illinois, 47% chance to win that from the field, not chance to win, but from the field on that lines. Rebounds, ladies and gentlemen, Illinois crushes that by a margin of a 42 rebounds per game compared to Purdue's 37. So the rebound front, second chance points have been eliminated, but Purdue makes up for that from making their shots efficiently. So that might come back to haunt them later if they have a bad day shooting from the field today. On the assist front, Purdue likes to get great ball movement, creating assists with about 21 compared to Illinois, 15 assists per game. Blocks, on the other hand, Illinois is in block city, baby. They're sending things to the third row with 5 blocks compared to Purdue's 3 blocks per game. And then on the steal front, man, Purdue is pickpocketing teams with 6.1 steals per game compared to Illinois, about 4 steals per game. So that's where we're kind of looking on that front, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be a tough one, a very tight one across the margins in this matchup. It's going to be tricky in this scenario and how this ends up shaking out between these two schools in the Big Ten play. We have to realize how close of a margin this is for the most part, ladies and gentlemen. But I like Purdue to edge this one out in this matchup, even though the blocks and the rebounds are going to come back to haunt Purdue in this game for sure. But I don't think we can ignore the field goal percentage and the steals for those easy fast breaks points that can come through. But the rebounds, like I said, will play a factor if they have a bad day from the field today. If they can't capitalize on those rebounds in this game, it's a wrap. It goes to Illinois to win that one for the matchup. So, things are relatively close if you look at the points given up and all that stuff. But the other stats are slightly kind of balancing out. It just depends on how the teams are feeling on that given day for the most part. So you can catch Illinois, number 11 in the nation, versus number 4, Purdue. Men's college basketball today, 3 p.m. Eastern time, noon Pacific time on Fox, ladies and gentlemen. So make sure you get your 3 p.m. snack, favorite spot in the house. Stay a little bit toasty, because I know for me in Columbus, Ohio, it's 9 degrees, so I don't want to be outside. I kind of don't want to go anywhere. I know other people in the country have worse temperatures than I do. I know up in the northern part of the Great Lakes, like in Minnesota, you have, you could say frozen trees exploding and stuff like that and all that scenario. So if you're up there, bundle up, stay warm. If you lose heat, try to go to a friend's house that has heat and stay warm. You got some great games today. And I know that snow system is trickling its way through, but please be safe if you decide to travel in the cold weather. If your area has snow, please drive with caution. Please listen to your state people, what they're trying to tell you about the weather conditions, and let the road people do their work so they can keep the roads clear for those who actually have to travel out in those winter weathery conditions. Now, let's reveal the game that we're kind of rounding out in the evening in the late slot, ladies and gentlemen. You got Houston, number 6 in the nation, versus Texas Tech, ladies and gentlemen. And this one, Saturday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time, 3:30 p.m. Pacific time on ESPN. What a great matchup we got here in the Big 12, ladies and gentlemen. You just can't get much better than that for the most part. You got the great matchup of Houston being 5-0 in conference play compared to Texas Tech's 5-1 in conference play, ladies and gentlemen. We got a great one in this matchup. A lot of great things that we can see here in the Big 12, but can Texas Tech run it back and disrupt Houston's season as we get closer to conference tournament play, as we are in late January and teams are trying to jockey for position to get some good seeding in the conference tournaments as they are around the corner as we start making our way to the dance of March Madness. But we are going to try to do a quick breakdown in the matchup. But these teams have faced each other before, and Houston won in a 4-point margin of victory. It was a 69-65. I think Houston can do it again, ladies and gentlemen, in this matchup when you have a head-to-head that when you have it in the last 5 games. But that was at the beginning of the month, and time has passed and seasons have changed from the beginning of January to now late January in this front. But Texas Tech, ladies and gentlemen, beat Baylor 92-73, beat BYU 84-71, beat Utah 88-74, and they beat Colorado by 2, 73-71. Now you look at Houston, ladies and gentlemen. They beat Arizona State 103-73. Beat West Virginia, Country Roads, Mountain Mama 77-84. No, 48 might be. They beat Baylor 77-55. So if you look at that margin of victory right there, you know, it's pretty convincing when you win by 22. But, you know, Texas Tech destroyed Baylor, dropping 92. See, when you get those head-to-heads like that, it makes it confusing, but you actually have the true head-to-head and winning by 4. And Houston beat Cincinnati 67-60 across that front, ladies and gentlemen. It's a thrilling of a matchup that we got going on, what we got cooking here in the Big 12. But let's break it down. Shall we look at the stat lines for these two schools in this scenario? You got the great Houston, barely even cracking 80 points a game. Like I said, only about 79 points per game, ladies and gentlemen. Compared to Texas Tech's almost 84 points per game. That edge is very large and crucial. But it's that defensive front that we are seeing here today. About 60 points that Houston gives up compared to Texas Tech's 73. That defense of Texas Tech is not there, ladies and gentlemen. Giving up 73 points per game is pretty detrimental, pretty critical if you want to look at that. From the field, Texas Tech is winning that front with a 47% from the field compared to Houston's 45% chance from the field. Rebounds, relatively even, about 38 across the board between both teams. Assists, about the same, 16 for both squads. Blocks, again, relatively similar. About 3.5 blocks per game for Texas Tech. For Houston, about 41 blocks per game. Steals, Houston's more on the scrappier side. About nine steals per game on average. And for Houston, about 6.5 steals per game. Ladies and gentlemen. Looking at that, the points that Houston puts up is not there, but they're creating the steals and the blocks on the defensive front so they don't have to score that many points. But Texas Tech has to find ways to capitalize on the defense when they can, because if they don't, it's going to be a long night, ladies and gentlemen. A long night for Texas Tech in this matchup. I don't think you can do that, giving up so many points. If you've given up 70, that's a problem. But when you look at the last time that they played, 69-65. Again, the teams didn't crack over 70, which goes into Houston's defense on why they're not giving up more than about 60 points per game on average, which seems pretty good. Pretty solid on paper, if you ask me. Giving up only 60 points per game in men's college basketball is pretty impressive. But they need to find ways to generate more points, because you just can't rely on your defense to win your championships like that. Yes, defense helps and those turnovers help, but you got to put the ball in the hoop. That's the name of basketball. If you can't do that, you might have a long day ahead of you for the most part. But I'm going to see if I can try to track down that head-to-head game, see if I can get more stats for you all today. But I know I will do a quick recap of all the scores that are currently going on at the 11 o'clock slate. For the most part, let me see if I can find that. I think the time might have shifted on me. Oh, tartar sauce. But I will try to dig that up for you guys in the meantime. Looking at that for the most part, let's see here. There we go. Oh, my bad, ladies and gentlemen. It's not at the 6:30 slot. It's actually 2 p.m. today. So my bad on that front. My bad. But if you're looking at the margin right there, ladies and gentlemen, yes, that game was in Houston. There's not much I can share about stat lines of that game to really help you see anything else along that point. But no, that was for today. And the spread, ladies and gentlemen, -1.5 for Houston. So very, very close margin. I think the last time when they played, it had a large impact to that game. But if we look at the last time they played each other, the halftime score was 31-31 in that sense. And then Houston ended up getting their 4 points in the second half to 34-38 in that matchup. And for the most part, ladies and gentlemen, the entire game was in favor of Houston until, the second half and started to change into Texas' favor for the most part, ladies and gentlemen, on that. But from the field that day, Houston was 39% from the field compared to Texas Tech's 41% from the field. For the threes, Texas Tech was shooting more threes percentage-wise with a 32% from the field for the 3 points, and Houston was at 24. Free throws, Texas Tech was doing the right thing. But keep in mind, if Houston was able to produce more points at the free throw line, they shot 77 from the free throw line the last time they played each other, and that was at the beginning of the month. Rebounds, about even, 35%. No, not 30, 35 rebounds for Texas Tech, 36. And the largest lead was 7 points for Houston, and the largest lead for Texas Tech was 6 points again. So definitely going to be something interesting this time around. I don't think we can overlook that margin for sure, but that will kind of wrap up that game for sure for the most part. Now let's take a look at the scores around the league of college basketball, ladies and gentlemen. So we might have a game that is finalized. And that we do, ladies and gentlemen. It looks like Georgetown for women's college basketball won 65-52. Give it up for Georgetown, everybody. That was a great game across the board. We can break down the stat line for you guys in the final portion of the game. The fourth quarter was fairly close. If you look at the fourth quarter score, 16-15 in that matchup. In that one, but that is a huge boost for conference play for Georgetown and hurting Xavier on that front. But the field, ladies and gentlemen, Xavier, 38% from that field today. Georgetown, 42% from the field. 3 points, 30%, 33% went to Xavier, 29% went to Georgetown. Free throws. Xavier didn't go to the free throw line a lot. They went to the free throw line twice and shooting 50%. Georgetown went to the free throw line a lot, 15 for 17, and gave them an 88% from the free throw line. Turnovers. In the turnover battle, Xavier had 23 turnovers compared to Georgetown 17 turnovers. Rebounds were even, actually, ladies and gentlemen. 32 for 32 for both teams. Largest lead for Georgetown was 16 compared to Xavier's 4. So that game kind of solved itself out for the most part. I don't think we can add too much oomph to that. I think it was a convincing Georgetown victory over Xavier. I don't think there was a swing and margin of victory. But like I said, ladies and gentlemen, the UConn women are dominating the Big East right now with a conference record of 10-0 and an overall record of 20-0. So we could see another UConn deep push in March Madness unless they lose early on in the rounding out months of January and going into conference tournament play. So let's take a quick peek at the other games that are in the 11 o'clock slot right now. That's might be fairly interesting to keep a close eye on right now. So let's take a look at the Army-Navy for women's basketball right now. They're down in Annapolis. Right now, the matchup is going fairly in the midshipmen's favor with a 28-19 game over Army right now in this matchup. Very, very good for Navy to see it. If we can see what their stat lines are looking like. Any good stats? Oh, yes, we do got some good stats for us right now. Navy is dominating the turnover game with 8 turnovers that they capitalized on. Army only has 1. Free throws, Navy's 60% from the free throw line compared to Army's 75, but Army's only been to the free throw line twice compared to Navy's 6 for 10 from the free throw line on that front. Threes, relatively even for the most part. 50% for Navy, Army 33, but Army has shot 6 threes and Navy has shot 4 threes. From the field, Army's just having a rough time from the field. They're 7 for 26, and that puts it at a 27% from the field, ladies and gentlemen, compared to Navy's 45% from the field. So that's 10 to 22. So like I said, the game from the field will kind of dictate on how a lot of these games will unfold for the most part, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think we can overlook from the field. If you shoot bad from the field, 9 times out of 10, you tend to lose those games unless something crazy happens. But if you shoot bad from the field, you normally lose majority of the games. Navy has the largest lead with 10 points and dominating the boards with 24 rebounds compared to Army's 9. So it's very possible, depending how this game ends up shaking out, Navy can win this matchup without much problem. But right now, it's 3:23 in the second before they go into half. Navy still up 28-21, ladies and gentlemen. Let me see what else. Another good game we got going on the women's side of things. Let's take a look at Boston College and Louisville right now, ladies and gentlemen. Woo! That game is starting to turn into a little bit of a runaway before we go into half with 45 seconds left in that game before we go into half. Boston College, a struggle of a year right now. For their overall record, ladies and gentlemen, it is 4-17, 0-8 in the ACC play. Louisville, on the other hand, 18-3 with an 8-0 record in the ACC right now for the most part. Largest lead for Louisville right now, ladies and gentlemen, was 27 points. Rebounds, Louisville's dominating with 20-11. Turnovers are pretty even right now, 10 across the board. Free throw line, 75 to 50%. And Boston College only has been to the line twice. And Louisville's been to the line 4 times. From the 3-point line, Louisville is 40%, shot 10 of them, made 4. Boston College is trying to shoot their way back into it by launching a lot of threes, which they launched 13 and only made 3. From the field, ladies and gentlemen, not looking too pretty. From the field, Boston College shot 30 and only made 8, which puts at 27% from the field. And Louisville shots 27 and made 17, which puts them at 63% from the field. Again, like I said, if you have a bad day from the field, you tend to lose the game. That is the stat bottom line for the most part and the women's side of things. As we start to shake out to the men's side, those are the 2 women's games that are relatively easy access outside of going to ESPN Plus that seem pretty interesting on the women's side of things. I would, like I said, the 11 o'clock slot for the women. Not too many rumbles in the jungles. You got Miami of Ohio and Ball State, Chattanooga versus Western Carolina, North Florida versus Eastern Kentucky, like I said, nothing too fancy. And the women's side of things for the 11 o'clock slate, ladies and gentlemen. So keep that in mind as you start to think about the noon slot and going on into the afternoon. Now let's take a look at the men's side. Let's see any of the score updates as we start rounding off the noon hour of men's and women's Saturday morning pregame kickoff here on Hardwood Gameday. What we got here, ladies and gentlemen, we got Ole Miss and Kentucky in this matchup, ladies and gentlemen. Ooh, we got a close one. We're about to round out the first half, ladies and gentlemen. 29-21 in favor of Kentucky right now with 56 seconds left in the first period, ladies and gentlemen, that we got going on here on the SEC slate. As we look through from the field, it's a very close matchup in the field. Kentucky's 33 compared to Ole Miss's 27% from the field. Very, very, very close, as you can see in this matchup. From the three, Ole Miss is bad with only making 1 from 10, and Kentucky is not also great either, making 4 for 15, which is a 27. Free throws are pretty much even, 70-75. Turnover margin is 6-7. Oh, no, we got 6-7. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Rebounds, we got 20-20 for rebounds. And the largest lead for points, ladies and gentlemen, was by Kentucky, 10. And Ole Miss had a largest lead of 4 points. So that is where that kind of ends up residing for the most part in that, and where they kind of sit in conference play. Relatively, Kentucky's up with a 4-2 SEC conference record compared to Ole Miss's 3-3, but that can easily change if somehow Ole Miss pulls a W out in that margin and switch that around. But leading the conference in the SEC right now is Texas A&M, followed up by Florida, both 5-1. Then you have Georgia, Arkansas, and Kentucky both at 4-2. And then you start trickling down to Alabama, Vanderbilt, Missouri, Auburn. Then you finally reach Ole Miss, and that points for that front. The other ones, there's really not too much more dramatic on the hardwood action with Mercer and Woolford. Woolford will probably find a way to slip into the dance. And then you have Northern Florida. So we're going to take a look at Mercer and Woolford in that scenario, ladies and gentlemen. The more I say it, the more I feel like I'm butchering the name of the Mercer Bears in this scenario, ladies and gentlemen. Right now, Mercer's up 43-36 at half on ESPN+. But if we're looking at the stat line, again, the field is showing Mercer has had 48% from the field compared to Woolford, 44% from the field. 3 points and pretty much good for both teams. 50% for Woolford. Mercer is 42. Free throw line, beautiful for Mercer with 80% from the free throw line. And Woolford a little stressing out on the free throw line with a 67% from the field. Rebounds in Woolford's favor with 21 compared to 14. Turnovers, Woolford's favor of 7-4. Largest lead is 7 for both teams. And then percentage led is about 49% to 44% for these two teams. And the conference right now and the division basically neck and neck jockeying for position. And East Tennessee State is your front runner for the conference that they're in. So definitely keep your eyes close to a possible late entrance for the tournament for March Madness. You got to look at the small conferences like where Samford is, Citadel, Furman, definitely teams we've seen in the tournament and don't end up going well, but also can create upsets if they have a good season for the most part. So definitely trying to figure out who's the dark horse in March Madness, who's going to get that right run at the right time, ladies and gentlemen, on that front. But as we start rounding it out on today's program, on the first edition of Hardwood Game Day by yours truly, Trevor Williams, we have a great day for you all today in the world of college basketball and college hoops. Like I said, try to stay warm out there in the cold, harsh environment of the weather that we got going on. Please be responsible as you go outside. And if you haven't, I know some people probably missed the window, but you probably should have went and grocery shop Thursday or yesterday on Friday, so you could have been stocked up, because some people might be snowed in a little bit longer than anticipated. A lot of the counties are saying that, like I said, for the snowstorm that is coming through for the Midwest and the Northeast and a little bit of the South with colder temperatures and icing. Like I said, if you don't have to be out, don't go out unless you truly have to. If you have a family member who might be elderly, I understand you want to go, make sure you go out and check on them and maybe help them shovel as best they can. But like I said, if you don't have to go out, please don't go out. That's all I can say with how this system's coming through. Like I said, we want you guys to be safe, and that's a great excuse to watch some great previous episodes of ETB so you can stay warm and cozy on these cold winter stretch of this Arctic blast that we got coming through next week here in the Midwest and in the Northeast, as well as other parts of the country, except for you, Florida. You're so lucky because you got your warm weather. So I don't want to hear you guys being depressed about cold weather compared to everyone else in the country. Yes, we care about you, Florida, but at the same time, you cannot complain with you having 70-degree weather, as everyone else in the country is below freezing, if not in the negatives. So you can party on your South Beach Islands, go down to Cancun and stay warm, as we here in the great Midwest and the Northeast will survive the cold, because that's how we are. That's how tough we are here on this side of the country. Not mean to brag about how great the Midwest and the Northeast is. I will stand my ground on that. I know people on the West Coast will say other things, but I digress with all y'all out there. Definitely a great show that we got going on here today, here on Hardwood Game Day. Like I said, the games in the noon slot definitely looking good. Get your favorite beverage, get things cozy, and we'll start to round out for today in college hoops. So thank you so much for tuning on to this edition of Hardwood Game Day. I won't be rambling on for much longer than that, but we'll conclude it here, and we'll catch you on for another edition of Hardwood Game Day. So long for now. Bye-bye.